Okay, this is chapter 25 presentation that I started on Friday. We just have a few slides left, and I figured we would go over that. And then with the remainder of the hour, if need be, if any of you want to use some time to get some of the active reading guide done, because it's due tomorrow, that's fine. We were talking about layers in the rock record and how many geologists, biologists look at the layers, the sedimentary layers, as basically like steps in a ladder going back in time. So the most recent layers, they say, are at the top, and the most distant layers in terms of time are near the bottom. So the Precambrian layers would be at the bottom. So the Cambrian Explosion was this idea that there was a time where many species started to form. So it was a major speciation event, according to the idea. And then later on, more complex organisms came about, like the mammals and the birds. The explanation as to how those complex structures could have formed is not real clear, but this is the way the story goes. We did learn already about how the evolution of DNA that's involved in regulation has been observed and can be selected by nature when we talk about genes that are regulated. Yes, Kyler?
So on the last slide, you talked about dinosaurs in the fossil record. Would dinosaurs be considered, would that be a genus or what?
Probably the family level. In most cases, you've got many different taxonomic families of dinosaurs, all of which are extinct. Unless you want to call the crocodile a dinosaur or a Komodo dragon a dinosaur, we could say the dinosaurs are extinct. Yes.
So that's a family level then? Or?
Most of the time, but remember, each family is divided into different genera. Each genus is divided into different species. So when geologists say that dinosaurs are extinct, whether they're saying families or species of dinosaurs are extinct, it's all correct.
Okay.
Yeah. Does that help?
Yeah, just making sure, because we have tons of animals now, but it's no different than if we were to have tons of those animals. It's right now with the animal kingdom, is it part of the animal kingdom?
Right.
And there's be a
right.
different subset of that?
Correct.
If they were still here.
Yep, dinosaurs were in the animal kingdom. Now, they probably fell into the same, they would have fallen into the same phylum as, birds and mammals, because after all, dinosaurs had backbones and had some other features that they share with other different major groups of organisms.
Right.
Sticklebacks. We learned about this already. Can anybody refresh my memory on the evolution of sticklebacks? How does this work? Ready, Marissa? Sticklebacks. What feature on the stickleback seemed to vary depending on location, population? The spine, that's right. So what was the advantage of having a spine for some sticklebacks? Yeah, exactly. If you have spines on your body, you're not going to be as easy to eat, at least as far as a predator fish coming along and trying to eat you. So this is an advantage in some environments where there are large predators. However, in an environment where there may not be very many large predators, having a spine may not have a clear advantage. And so nature might actually permit the degeneration of these spines over time. And so different sticklebacks have different variations of these spines, or no spine at all. And it's because of the DNA that's involved in regulating or turning on or turning off that gene that codes for spines. That DNA, of course, can mutate, and if it does, it may not be a problem if, again, that stickleback does not have to worry about large predators coming along and eating it. So when we talk about evolution, students, most of the time what we're talking about is just changes in allele frequencies. If a mutated gene happens or occurs, that mutated gene may happen with more and more frequency if it's not really a detriment to that population. On the other hand, if the population is at a disadvantage, if it doesn't have spines, then that mutation probably won't persist through the generations. Okay? Any questions about that? Okay. So this is about evolutionary change in the rate of development of events. Okay, so when we talk about the development of embryos and the similarities among them, the development of, let's say, this salamander. Normally, salamanders have gills in their early development. Okay, but those gills will eventually fade away, and the fins will eventually fade away as well, and legs will form. But in some environments, the adult salamanders keep their gills. Can anybody think of an advantage of keeping your gills if you're a salamander? Kylan?
You could go underwater and breathe underwater.
Yeah, you can stay underwater. That's right. You don't have to surface. So for salamanders that live in caves, underwater caves, this is really a big advantage. So nature has actually selected those developmental genes that permit the persistence of gills into adulthood, and so this would be an advantage for those particular salamanders.
I didn't know you could have gills and
Huh?
I don't know you could have gills and like another respiratory system.
Well, I don't know if you could say that these guys have developed lungs. They may have lungs that are not really fully functional. I don't know much about the species, but these guys are using their gills to breathe. For whatever reason, they stay underwater all the time, so there's an advantage to having gills all the time in that case.
So then in
Yep.
that case, the salamanders that remain with their gills, they don't live on land, they remain in the water?
Correct. Yep. There's a species of salamander that lives in caves, underwater caves, and I don't remember the name of it. I believe that's what we're looking at right here. Yes. Yes, you may. So when we talk about the development of different kinds of species, if there's a similarity in development, then you might reason that, well, that's evidence of a relationship if you're a Darwinian. So for example, if there's a similarity in how the human cranium develops in the fetal state to how the cranium develops in a chimpanzee in the fetal state, well, one would look at that, or could look at that and say, well, that's evidence of a relationship. But understand that we're basically circling back to an original assumption that we're making, all right? Any questions about that? Yes, Carlin?
So why does it look like the chimpanzee like loses bone and we
Loses
well, no, because
bone.
look at the forehead of the fetus
Yeah.
and look at the forehead of the chimpanzee. Like definitely, like the chimpanzee fetus, the chimpanzee adult, their forehead's not fusing; it's literally losing something.
Yeah.
But the human would not lose anything; it just fuses together.
It's interesting, isn't it?
It's like
Yeah.
why does the chimpanzee lose bone structure?
Yeah. I don't know why the cranium, size of the cranium in relation to the jaw, or that ratio substantially changes as we go into adulthood. Is it for a chimpanzee? I don't know the answer to that question, and I don't know why the structure changes as much as it does. It's interesting.
Maybe they just get dropped too often.
Yeah, I don't know.
Is it a possibility?
There's also a lot of variation in skull structure in humans. So like when you look at people's foreheads, some people have really short foreheads, some people have really prominent brow ridges, some people don't. And it's just interesting to see that variation.
I'm not a chimpanzee.
Homeotic genes. So these are master regulatory genes. They determine the location and the organization of different body parts. We've gone over this in a past unit. But these genes determine the development of specific body parts in a certain order. They need to develop in the right place and at the right time. And so if an evolutionary biologist notices a similarity in the kinds of developmental genes that lead to the production of, let's say, the abdomen or the head, and if we're comparing different species of insects and we find these kinds of genes similarly arranged and similarly expressed, then one might say, well, these two species of insects certainly are related through a common ancestor, and this shows us the degree of relatedness. So understand that every single similarity, whether it's a physical structural similarity or a genetic similarity or an embryological developmental kind of similarity, all those similarities are seen through that lens, that Darwinian view of the world. Now whether you want to see through that lens for yourself, that's up to you, but understand that that's the starting assumption. So these Hox genes are examples of the homeotic genes. All right, so exaptations, it's hard to say. Exaptations. These are structures that are imagined to evolve and become co-opted for another function. So feathers are unique to birds. But birds use feathers for more purposes than just flight. What else do they use them for? At least some types of feathers can be used for what purpose besides flight? Okay, if the feathers are colorful, absolutely. So they are involved in sexual selection for sure. What else?
Like heat.
What about it?
Regulating.
Yes, that's right. So they can be used for insulation. So feathers come in all different types, but if one were to argue that the original function of feathers was not flight and rather was some other function, well, if you're a Darwinian, you might argue that those feathers took on a new role and that somehow they developed the right shape to be a useful airfoil. When I say airfoil, I mean structured in such a way that air can flow over it to enhance flight. Now, this is an artist's representation of what they think some kind of ancestor species might have been, an ancestor species that they say may have linked together today's birds and reptiles. So again, we're using our imagination here, but how a feather could just develop through mutation to give an organism this enhanced ability to fly, it's a little bit challenging to think about. All right, so unanswered questions. Let's talk about fossils. Fossils are really cool because they kind of give us a glimpse into the past, especially when we talk about species that no longer exist today. So whether they be dinosaurs or anything else. And what's so amazing about some fossils is that they are pristine preservations of these organisms, sometimes whole bodies. Notice here this fish that was in the process of eating another fish. Now, we're told that sediments generally are laid down gradually or slowly over time. And that's a uniformitarian worldview. But then we have some fossils that kind of buck against that idea. Here we see this fish was caught in the act. It seems that this fish was suddenly buried. Maybe sediment rushed over it so quickly this fish was not able to get out from under that or to swim away. And it happened very, very rapidly. At least that's what it seems when you look at this picture. Now, if organisms are buried very slowly and gradually by sediments, then that would give the bodies of dead organisms a chance to at least partially decompose and break down. But clearly, this fish's body was not the case. Scavengers otherwise would have come along, consumed part of the body. And a lot of fossils do have only partial remains left over, but this one was wholly intact. So another great mystery is that when you go to a place like a canyon, Grand Canyon, the Grand Canyon, how many of you have been there? Grand Canyon, okay, pretty cool place. And most geologists will stand there with you if they're there with you, and they'll say, okay, took millions of years for these layers to be laid down. But then we see fossils like this, and it kind of makes us wonder what's going on exactly. What conclusion can you make when you see a picture like this in a canyon wall?
What is that?
What is it?
Yeah.
Okay, you're looking at a tree trunk,
Oh.
a fossilized tree. Yep. So, as an observer, as a scientist, when you look at that, are there any conclusions that you can reasonably make or not?
Yeah, maybe that's like the roots. A long
Roots?
root.
Maybe the roots would have been down here, although you can't really see the roots now. Any other conclusions?
There was a landslide.
Because it's all in one piece.
Okay, listen carefully. What did you say, Kylan? Or not Kylan? Kayla. I got my Kylans and my Kaylas mixed up. Go ahead.
That it was covered quickly because it's all in one piece. It didn't have time to decay or break down.
Or the alien.
Okay, interesting observation. So students, let's say just to entertain ourselves, let's say that Kayla's mistaken, and we say that this tree was slowly buried. I'm not saying you are mistaken.
Oh, no. I'm
Let's say it was slowly buried. All right. Well, what processes would naturally occur over the eons, over the centuries, the millennia, that would keep this tree from looking like this? What do trees normally do once they've, died, or they've fallen in a forest, or even if they've been knocked over by either by wind or by whatever other cause? What happens to trees over time?
They decay.
They decay. They decompose. Yes. So if it took, let's say, I don't know, I'll just throw out a number. Let's say 1,000 years for these layers to be laid down. What is it that kept these parts of this dead tree from decaying or decomposing? Anybody think of a way?
What if the rock had like minerals to feed it or something?
All right. Well, what you are looking at most likely is rock. It's mineralized remains that is basically like a cast, and it's taken on the form of a tree that once existed in these layers. But going back to Kayla's hypothesis, she says that it seems when you look at this picture, maybe it was buried very quickly. Do we have an alternative hypothesis?
Flood or a landslide.
Okay, all right. So guys,
You said it was covered slowly. You could say that it was covered in small increments, which allowed the tree to continue to live while it was still being covered, if it was only yay much at a time. You know?
Okay,
'Cause then
all
it would
right.
just be like soil. I don't know.
yeah, so I mean there are some species of trees that have been known to live for millennia. Remember, if you go to the Grand Canyon now, we're talking not hundreds or even thousands, we're talking about millions of years according to the geological conventional worldview. It would say, it took millions of years for these layers to be laid down. So it seems like we're playing a little bit of mental acrobatics here, but Kayla, you seem to be making an observation that so far makes sense. Does anybody object, though?
I just have a question.
That this tree was buried quickly? Kayla says it was probably buried quickly. Yes, Carlin?
So what if there was so the Great Canyon's caused by erosion, right? That's what the canyon happened.
That's what they say.
So if say the canyon was at that point where the tree's at the bottom,
Uh-huh.
and it kind of just grew alongside the rock, and then it kept eroding, but the tree stayed there, and then you know what I'm saying?
So you're saying the tree kept on living as these sediments were being laid down?
No, I think the sediments were already laid down, and then the tree grew into the side of it.
Weird.
It
Okay.
happens.
I don't know. Have you seen that happen before?
Yeah,
Like the trees.
weeds grow into my sidewalk.
That'd be a big weed. That'd be a really big weed. All right. So you guys can answer that mystery in your own mind. Thank you, Kayla, for your contribution there. All right. Next. This is a place that I've actually visited myself. It's near a ghost town in Calico, California. It's not too far from, I forget the name of the town, but it's in the desert. Anyway, check it out. See these sedimentary layers? They've been bent, and so there is a fault line that runs right along through this ghost town area. And so usually sediments don't easily bend unless they haven't had a chance to fully harden yet. Now you do see some breaking and buckling up here, but especially towards the bottom in this picture, and when you see going from the bottom to the top in this picture, there's not really any breakage or buckling going on, which leads one to wonder just how quickly or slowly were these sediments laid down. Because remember, when we talk about rock layers or sediment layers, though they might be rock today, that's not necessarily because they were always rock. Sediments are laid down usually as particulate matter. Maybe it's mud, or it could be just dirt that has some water in it. And as it hardens, it's kind of like concrete. Over time, it'll become rock. And so this is kind of a mystery in the geological world. Yeah.
So if there was a valley, and then the mud just laid on top, single layers. Is that a possibility?
Okay, so if you're saying if there's a corrugation or a dip in the landscape,
right?
If these sediments could have laid to kind of fit with the
Right.
irregularity in the landscape. Okay.
Wouldn't it at that point then like all
here's-
sink into the little
Yeah. So here's
pattern?
the problem with
Well, I
that.
don't know.
Let's imagine Kylan says maybe there was just like a little valley or a dip in the landscape, and then sediment rolls in. It's probably, instead of rolling in and forming layers, it's probably going to fill like a basin. And, and so then you have this mud pit basically. And then of course maybe over time it'll harden, but it's not going to form layers that are as nicely curved as you might imagine. At least I don't think the laws of physics would permit that.
Unless it's like a semi-permeable mud. That's
I don't
not
know.
liquid.
I don't know. But those are unanswered questions. Anybody have another idea? Kylan proposed his hypothesis.
Or it's aliens again.
Maybe I'm mistaken. Maybe it wouldn't feel like a basin.
You
Alright.
said that this is on a fault line?
Yeah. It's near a fault line, yeah. That's
Or
right.
there's an earthquake and it like
Yes.
fell down.
Right. So what happened was there was an earthquake. Those sedimentary layers that were over that fault line would have become deformed. So if these tectonic plates were moving against each other or slightly towards each other, then that might cause those sediments to deform. But did this happen when they were still soft? Or if they were hard, how is it that this happened without causing multiple points of buckling and breaking if it's rock that was already laid down, if it already hardened, and then earthquake came? A little bit tricky. Some other interesting problems. I talked about radiometric dating and how scientists do generally trust it quite a bit, but sometimes there is some data that's offered up that doesn't necessarily fit with the worldview. So, for example, here's a mountain in, I think it's New Zealand, and some geologists went to the top to test these rocks just to see how old they were, and they wanted to see if their measurement techniques were accurate. And this volcano had erupted about 50 years ago or so. And they thought, well, we should get a pretty young age. These rocks that are there were spewed out from the deep earth, and those rocks, once they solidified, should yield a relatively young age. Okay, but then they were getting these really big numbers, like 1.3 million years and so on. So it seemed to cast a little bit of doubt, at least on some methods of radiometrically dating rocks. This is a summary of what we learned on Friday. How does radiometric dating work? Anybody remember this? Zach?
Oh, I don't know, they'll take the photons, I think,
Okay.
of whatever rock they're looking at, and then go through and like cut down the time by
Okay.
half each time, and then it gets this curve
Uh-huh.
graph of how long the rock has been around.
Okay. Good. Sort of. So 1 half-life is the amount of time for what?
Half of the original amount to decay.
Yes, very good. So, like, for example, carbon-14 could decay into nitrogen-14. And so how long does it take for that conversion to take place? Well, the amount of time for half of the carbon-14 to decay into nitrogen-14 is referred to as 1 half-life, which for this would be 5,700 and some years. Yes, Kyle?
So at what point do they consider the rock or the radioactive element to be completely decayed if it's only half-lives? Because like, keep using half-lives,
Yeah.
it will never reach 0.
Right.
At what point do they consider it completely decayed?
That's a good question.
Until they can't detect it.
Yeah, there you go. Because
Just like-
the instruments they use are only so sensitive. Once you can't detect it, then you know that all you're left with is the daughter isotope. You can essentially say that all we have is the daughter isotope. We don't have any more of the mother isotope. The mother isotope is what's on the left. Daughter isotopes are what are on the right. Now, if we had enough time to actually trace the conversion of half of this amount of uranium to lead, that would take 710 million years if we could live that long. All right? Makes sense? All right. but we're making a few assumptions here. First assumption, we're assuming that in the original rock, there is no daughter isotope. None. All right? So we're also making a second assumption, and that is the rate of decay is constant, regardless of environmental conditions, regardless of temperature, regardless of pressure, and so on. Humidity, things like that. Now, I'm going to post on Google Classroom a link to some scientific literature that talks about just some pitfalls and unanswered questions regarding just how reliable the radiometric dating methods are. There have been studies done where there were excess daughter elements found in rocks that were known to be much younger than they actually were. So, but you can look at that on your own time later on if you want. Okay, so Mount St Helens is another example of a volcano, of course, that recently erupted. So about 40 years ago, not even 40 years ago. So there have been some geologists that have gone there to do some tests on the rocks, and they expected some young numbers, right? But instead of getting numbers that were young, they got really old numbers, close to 500,000 years for some of those rocks that, of course, spewed up to the surface as recently as 40 years ago. So it does cast some questions on what our assumptions are and whether our assumptions are always valid when we're dating rocks. And of course, fossils are found in some of these rocks, although with volcanic rocks, it's a little bit tricky because usually organisms will die if they get buried in volcanic rock, because if it's really, really hot, you're not going to have fossils. So it's very, very rare for a fossil to be found in an igneous rock, which is a volcanic rock. You could have volcanic boulders, of course, roll over dead organisms or living organisms, and you maybe could have remains in that way. You could have fossils buried under igneous rock in that manner. Yes?
So for the Mount St Helens one,
Yeah.
just because the rock was formed in 1986, doesn't that not mean that the stuff used to form it was possibly 3,500 years ago, 350,000 years ago?
Okay, good question. Yeah.
So and then same with the second one, the lava that formed the rock at Mount Megaro. What if that's 3.5 billion years, but the rock, just because the rock formed, then does that, what if the material used to form it, is that actually that old?
Good question. Maybe I should explain what we mean by formation of a rock. We don't mean appearing out of thin air.
Right.
What we actually mean is, when did this rock solidify after that volcanic event occurred? That's actually what we mean by formation of the rock.
Right. So
Okay.
is that age, are they saying that age is when it became solidified?
Right.
Oh, okay.
That's
So
right. So obviously the material that formed the volcanic rocks at the top of this volcano ultimately originated from somewhere deep in the mantle of the planet.
Right.
So when we say that, if we start with this number here, or if we start with just knowing that those rocks solidified 40 years ago when the eruption happened, we're not saying that the material that makes the rock is 40 years old, because the material came from the magma deep down under the Earth's surface.
Mm-hmm.
So the formation means, when did this solidify?
Gotcha.
Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay. Yep. Oh, that's it. Cool.